Hello and welcome to an edition of my curations, perhaps the first of many. And I've got something delicious for you today, if perhaps a little rare. We have the Hannibal multiverse. You don't really hear those words put together too much. I don't know how much of a crossover there is between the comic book sort of audience and the horror audience. I would assume there are perhaps a few overlapping Venn diagrams there. What with you got the comic books that you see based on horror properties. There's Alien comic books, there's Army of Darkness and whatnot, but going through the different fandoms online, I actually don't really see a whole lot of people trying to map out this multiverse that Thomas Harris brought to us in 1981, what with the first novel, Red Dragon. It kind of lit everything up, especially with the follow-up film adaptation, 1986, Manhunter. Let's continue the production timeline here. Then you had the Silence of the Lambs novel come out in 1988, with the film adaptation just a few years later in 1991. And then after that, you had the Hannibal novel in 1999, with the follow-up film adaptation just 2 short years later with Hannibal, the film. And then a Red Dragon film adaptation actually retconning Manhunter. See, the film adaptation was kind of meant to be a sequel to that 1986 film, but they retconned it with a noticeably older Anthony Hopkins in 2002. Then they decided to put a prequel on the whole thing, getting into the mysterious backgrounds of Hannibal Lecter in 2006, with the follow-up film just the next year in 2007, Hannibal Rising, and then the pinnacle of the entire franchise, the Hannibal TV series in 2013. So as you can see, there's a bit of taffy there to chew on, and a bunch of filmmakers and artists. A bunch of filmmaker and artists have kind of pulled that taffy. They've really chewed on it quite a bit. You have a lot of different interpretations. So again, there was that production timeline. I'm going to give you the chronological timeline of the Hannibal Lecter multiverse. See, there's the Hannibal Rising prequel, as I said. In these film adaptations, they're great, but there are a lot of different interpretations. So the Hannibal Rising film could actually be seen before any of these films, honestly, and the timeline works as much as it can in any of these universes. The timeline's kind of messy all over the place. Universe A I have here starts with Manhunter, that 80s film I mentioned. The follow-up, Silence of the Lambs film with Jodie Foster, and the Hannibal sequel film there. And then in Universe B, which I would say is kind of the cleanest, give or take, of the film timelines. You've got Red Dragon, Silence of the Lambs, the Hannibal film. And then in Universe C, and now bear with me here, and I'm trying my best to sort of start this out without the spoilers. We'll get into the spoiler stuff later. Universe C, you would watch Hannibal Rising again. Like, Hannibal Rising goes before any of these. Hannibal Rising, then the Hannibal TV series, and then the Silence of the Lambs film. Because the TV series retcons out any of the interpretations of Red Dragon, as well as the interpretation of the Hannibal story being used as a sequel to Silence of the Lambs. And if you haven't seen it, those are my ways that I recommend you watch this universe. Start with Hannibal Rising, and then pick from A, B, or C. Now, A, you sort of get into a lot of 80s cheese there, especially with Manhunter. With B, you're sort of seeing just a very cinematic view of these films. And then Universe C, it's my favorite viewing. You watch Hannibal Rising, the Hannibal TV series, then Silence of the Lambs. Got it? All right, so let's get into the spoiler stuff. So if you haven't watched Hannibal, that's my curation. Go out into the world, view that, come back and join us later. If you are familiar with these and you're over there screaming at your screen about my interpretation of things, let me explain myself a little bit. So I'm not a Puritan. I'm sort of I'm into looking at the whole universe. You know, when it comes to any franchise, I want to see the whole thing and sort of parse out different watch orders and whatnot. That's kind of my bag. If my site's up at this point, check out my site. I have it linked on my YouTube channel, and you can see some of the timelines and stuff. And I also do a little bit of making playlists and soundtracks, so check that out as well. So before I get into explaining those watch orders I mentioned, so you can do the production timeline. If you want to get the whole universe, alternate these novels and films a little bit, and just look at everything in the way it was built, And then if you're a chronological dork, if you're a canon dork like me, I've got those universes there. I'm going to go ahead and get into my review now, my personal review, and then I'll explain a little bit more because, here's my review. So the books are great, as they are the source for this entire story, but I would say Thomas Harris suffers from the same issue. He's got the same propensity that, say, Stephen King has for over detailing, adding unnecessary elements, describing scenes and characters at length with no payoff later, while leaving other things you would figure are more critical questions unanswered and more things vague, and adding just off the wall, unrealistic actions. For example, spoilers for the novel again, it's all spoilery. The novel Hannibal, it ends with Hannibal psychically driving Clarice Starling into adopting the role of his sister Misha, and then at some point nursing from her breast for some reason. And again, it's like Stephen King, the end of It, ends with this fucking child orgy or some bullshit. They're crazy, entrancing writers for a reason. It's because they have just crazy, off-the-wall imagination. So some of this may have been due to a lack of time to edit. As you notice in that production timeline, there wasn't much time between books and film adaptation. That's because the studio was rushing to make all these cash grabs and kind of trying to light a fire under Thomas Harris and get him, whether or not they forced his hand to write some things for them, or Thomas Harris just wanted to race and get his shit on the shelves before they put their shit in theaters. There's a lot of conjecture there with that. But Mr. Harris, if you look at his novels, he works at this deliberate pace. He's very thought out, methodical on what he wants to get done, and a lot of his crime thrillers, all of his books, he does an extensive amount of research ahead of time. He would actually go to FBI behavioral classes, as a way of doing research here, and he would do interviews with tons of fucking serial killers and shit to get his view on these characters. So, and the films are mostly great. They take Mr. Harris's books, they sanitize them, they condense them and structure them into these archetypal stories. It makes for quick, easy consumption, and that's why I push these, these timelines, because it's a good way to consume the things quickly and efficiently, because we live in that fucking rat race world. So each chapter of the Hannibal films were produced. They kind of suffered from the same issue that a lot of superhero and comic book adaptations suffered from at that time. These things would, they wanted to jam 200 issues into a film. They wanted to jam, a 2,000-page book into a film, and so I digress. So there's the pinnacle of the film series, The Silence of the Lambs, which is what elevated this canon to the echelon of franchise media. You lose through doing that all these nuances, like Jack Crawford's history and Jamie Gumm's history and the history of Will Graham. Love Edward Norton to death is Will Graham. it's not, especially if you go back and you watch Hugh Dancy's, it's not. He's just a normal FBI dude. Like, he's not like this autistic savant. So all these things are addressed in small sentences here and there in these movies. As I mentioned earlier, there's a messy timeline, as Silence of the Lambs was meant to be a sequel to Manhunter, but the later adaptation of Red Drag, retcons this, and all these films have just messy recastings. Jack Crawford goes through like a different actor in every movie, and it's jarring, and so again, Manhunter was wrought with the issues of many 80s movies, and now if you watch that movie, super cringy. And then the sequel of Silence, Hannibal, it's another masterpiece. You got filmmaker Ridley Scott behind the camera, so it's going to be good. He did a tight work of cleaning up the novel, especially that gut-turning ending that I mentioned, and gave it a more open-ended conclusion. It looks like they're setting up for a sequel that just never fucking happens. So it suffers from like those recastings that I mentioned. I forget who. Man, I can't believe I forgot who did Clarice Starling, but not nearly as captivating as Jodie Foster. Still did a great job. But the reward of all this timeline breaking and everything, and these recasts, is that there is an unrecognizable Gary Oldman as Mason Verger. His interpretation was I mean, it's up there with Anthony Hopkins and Hannibal, so you lose the nuances though of his character's sister Margot, Inspector Potsy, Mason's right hand man Cordell. Like you don't really get to see a lot of all that. Let's also note that sort of all over the place here. Bear with me. Still new at this. So like certain nuances get lost going back to Red Dragon, where Will Graham he adopts in the books and later in the TV series we'll get to, he adopts a pre-existing family as a way of attempting to escape his darkness rather than succeeding in creating a new family, which is what he does in that Red Dragon movie. Also, most notably, it would seem that Dr. Chilton got a haircut on the way up the stairs at the end of that movie. See, and this is one of the many weirdnesses about the timeline that I mentioned, is that, like, Silence of the Lambs came out in 91, but it's probably meant to be based in the late 80s, judging from the soundtrack and the garb and whatnot. They did that Red Dragon prequel, retconning Manhunter, super 80s movie, retconning, but in that movie, it's so obviously the early 2000s. So it's like, why did this thing in the early 2000s happen right before this 80s thing that happened? It just makes no sense. And Dr. Chilton in Silence of the Lambs, he had a fucking mullet. But in fucking Red Dragon, like, he's got this short, like early 2000s Pierce Bronson type thing. So it's like, it doesn't really, there are so many things that just don't jive. I mean, it's great, but they're great on each of their own, but as a cohesive canon, doesn't work very well. I mean, you can still view them and do that thing that I do when you're watching superhero movies and sort of like edit them in your brain and be like, all right, that's actually not Terrence Howard, like that kind of thing, like, oh, these things still could have happened. Like, if you look at, like, say, all the Batman movies, technically, I would say all the movies could be seen in the same universe in the same way that James Bond movies could all be happening in the same universe. And some things repeat for some fucking reason. There's obviously a bunch of different Jokers, not just one Joker. And, like, weird little recasts, it's like a play. Actors are going to change out from time to time. It's the nature of the whole beast. It is, unless you got a slick, tight high budget TV series that we'll get to. There's also Hannibal Rising, as I mentioned, a perfectly adequate prequel. But if I'm not mistaken, again, it doesn't really fit in with the timeline of like this shit happened in the 80s, this shit happened in the 90s. This Hannibal Rising, it might have happened in the 40s, might have happened in the 60s. Who fucking knows? Like, you watch that movie and it's just like, I see what they're doing, but how am I going to fit in all this? Doesn't really fit in with everything else. And right. Like, so are we supposed to believe that guy was a young Anthony Hopkins? Again, it goes back to that actor thing I was talking about. So let's just fall back on blaming the studio for all these issues. I mean, all this, like, I'm writing the shit, I'm directing the shit, you can't keep capturing that same lightning in the bottle like Silence of the Lambs did. It's just not going to happen. So the magnum opus, as I keep teasing, is the Hannibal TV series. Even though Bryan Fuller confesses that he views it as a professional fanfic of sorts, even Mr. Harris admits that he loves that show, but he throws a little shade at Mads Mikkelsen and his accent, which is a fair criticism, I would say. Some might just say he's jealous, but as it is one of the many things that changed in the adaptation of the stories. I mean, in the books, Dr. Lecter's supposed to have 6 fingers on his left hand. No one's done that because it's one of those weird, unnecessary details like that I mentioned. But in the books, he explains that Dr. Lecter's accent is like kind of American, kind of European, but it's mostly like a mix of as he moved throughout the Southeast, like Louisiana up through Virginia and stuff, like, and that's why Hopkins portrays it with a slight Southern drawl, furthermore, some of the genders of the characters are swapped. Any story related to the Lambs is omitted, as I mentioned before, and the entire timeline of events have been switched around and updated and compressed to just happening in this like 2 or 3 year period. But any change, I would argue, definitely an improvement, objectively. There are no in-world inconsistencies. Every character's nuance is thoroughly explored. The cinematography, staging, and editing is just utterly artistic. The performances, even when drawing from already established characterizations, like Raul Esparza sort of channeled Anthony Held for Chilton. He's definitely kind of doing that professional thing that, a collegiate psychiatrist would probably do, that sort of pretentious kind of thing. Or Joe Anderson was definitely doing Gary Oldman's thing from Hannibal, where he's just like, get Dr. Lecter. He's doing sort of an impersonation, but it's still just fits right in. It's great. It's always interesting. And the writing of that show. I mean, I've watched the series 3 times and I still just pick up on new entendres every time. It's just layers of meaning. You got some sort of biblical revelation shit, which fits right in with the William Blake shit that, Red Dragon draws from. Just the like, there may be some jokes that you might not even get unless you're like kind of hooked up into the world of psychiatry. Like, it's very PhD level writing there, So, and everything moved at while being compressed in that timeline at the slow burning suspenseful pace. Like, it's so binge worthy. Of course, the last 8 episodes got rushed because, again, thanks to the studio, they were like, this shit's too heavy for us, Doc. And then, like, they cut it off, which is fine. Because, again, I would say you could easily watch, like, Hannibal Rising, the Hannibal TV series, Silence of the Lambs, and you got yourself... Oh, and this is what I teased earlier, but was waiting to get through the review to tell you. So, the ending of the Hannibal TV series, like many things, could be viewed either as allegorical or some sort of dramatization. Like, I would say, if you want to look at these universes, of course, at the end of the day, it's all because it's individual artistic interpretation. If you're a nerd like me, who, likes to make shit up, maybe there's some time travel shenanigans. Maybe Hannibal meditates into his fucking memory palace and pulls himself back in time or forward in time at some point, you know. Or maybe it's just, you could view the Hannibal TV series as being like a interpretation of Hannibal himself, like that, and that's why the world looks so artful, and he kind of becomes more of a sympathetic anti-hero. I mean, almost anti-hero rather than a villain. I mean, like in the films, he's clearly just this villain up until you get to the Hannibal movie, and then he's kind of an anti-hero, but, you know, it's still evil as fuck. In the TV series, he's kind of portrayed as sort of this Luciferian nihilist scientist with a predilection to eat motherfuckers because he sees them as animals and not people. But he always, like, most of the people he eats are like bad guys or whatever. And or you could view it as like, this is the interpretation of like what really happened, because like in the films were like sort of like an adaptation of these events or something, because like in the TV series they do certain things, like at the beginning of Red Dragon, the film, Anthony Hopkins is like watching the Philharmonic Orchestra and he's watching some motherfucker like fuck up the piece, and later on he eats that motherfucker. In the book, they imply that guy went missing, and they imply Hannibal may have ate him, but maybe not. In the TV series, they retcon it as like, he definitely didn't kill that motherfucker. That was a whole different killer. That was a whole different guy, and all the other killers tend to sort of be like on this web where at the top is Hannibal, sort of psychically driving people to do shit and what have you. It's part of the art of that show is just, let's take this to a different place. It's wonderful, and again, that's why you can just follow it up with Silence of the Lambs, because they didn't get to all that, and like say Hannibal did make it out of the fucking the muck that, you know, he like maybe he wasn't really killed by Will Graham, he survived the fall, or that whole scene was just allegorical. There's so many things in that show that could just be seen as allegorical and not entirely literal, you know, like the Bible, you know, like I said, there's that biblical shit in there. So Will Graham embraced the darkness, he arrested Hannibal saw it as a triumph, but they both fell like the angels that he admires. He gets shipped off back to fucking Boston. Will Graham winds up drunk in the Florida Keys back with his family. Like, you could view Silence of the Lambs as like, oh, Hannibal like survived. That last scene was just in Will Graham's sick head or something, because you are kind of seeing things from their points of view mostly through that show. So that's my explanation for the universe. So that my recommended watch order: Hannibal Rising, Hannibal the TV series, Silence of the Lambs. You can also explore those other things I talked about, but that's my thing. So I would just conclude this breakdown by pointing out that this franchise not only incurs the consequences and benefits of adaptation and multiverse building as the Stephen King mythos, but also undertakings that you see in adaptations of comic book properties. Both things we'll explore more on this channel. So when you have a dense, prolific source material, it is inevitable that a studio will try and profit from it, and artists will do their best to interpret it. And thankfully, the models of these endeavors are improving, learning from all the cheesy prototypes of bygone eras. Hopefully they'll do more Hannibal on like HBO or Peacock. Probably Peacock. Netflix. It's fucking breaking bars over there. So this is my first edition of the October 2020 curations. Maybe more horror stuff coming down the pike because you know, it is that season for the spook. Stay snide.